This is the first of 4 short mini lectures on Lacan's notion of the mirror stage. We'll say just by way of introduction that although when Lacan formulates these ideas and makes reference to them as a stage, that ultimately the mirror stage is much more than a stage. You could say that it's a paradigm of human subjectivity. So rather than seeing this as a kind of one-off or early developmental phase of sorts, it is in fact an aspect, an oft-repeated, frequently ongoing process of human subjectivity that's characteristic of human beings across their lifespan. So in order to try and make the material a little bit more accessible, what I want to do in this short talk is talk about what I've called challenges of prematuration. In other words, if we're going to understand why the explanations that Lacan offers in the mirror stage are so important, it's useful to get a sense of some of the dilemmas, the challenges, the problems that the newborn infant is responding to. When I say challenges of prematuration, I mean to emphasize that when Lacan speaks about the challenges of the newborn infant, he's not going to simply fall back upon a reliance on the notion of instincts. For him, you could say that human beings are lacking in a kind of instinctual endowment. They don't have an adequate profile, an adequate set of instincts that will enable them to survive for any length of time. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm sure some of you have had the great pleasure of watching David Attenborough's many nature programs. And if you have, you will have obviously seen at some point, the one that comes to my mind is the image of a baby whale being born. We've all seen these images of a little foal being born, a little whale being born, where we see a mammal that is born and often within minutes has a degree of viability. They're able to walk around, they're able to move. Sure, they need to be cared for, but they've got some kind of basic physical mobility. Lacan would argue that human beings don't have that. And in fact, it's not just that Lacan argues that, and I think we all know that. Left to their own devices, human infants would surely perish. So we have a dilemma then. If human beings don't have an adequate number of instincts, if they don't have a kind of preset, basic biological, physiological set of abilities, what is it that enables them to pull together a whole series of disparate physical and bodily experiences and start to function as a unified, viable entity? As we'll see, Lacan's answer to that is going to be an image that needs to be identified with. So we'll develop a little bit more of that argument, but I think it's also useful here, whenever we talk about Lacan, actually, it's useful to put him in touch with Freud. So I wanted to just point out here what I've called Freuds Dilemma, the need for a new psychical action. So in Freud's Narcissism, an introduction, he poses this dilemma for us. He says, a unity comparable to the ego cannot exist in the individual from the start. The ego has to be developed. The autoerotic instincts, however, are there from the very first. So there must be something added to autoeroticism, a new psychical action, in order to bring about narcissism. So let's see if we can unpack that a little bit. Essentially, Freud's dilemma in his paper on narcissism is to say that it's not difficult to explain that a newborn infant may have a degree of autoerotic pleasures taken within the realm of their own body. There may be infantile forms of masturbation, basic bodily pleasures that the infant can take from their own body. So that's not so difficult to understand. What is difficult, though, is why would they start to find another body, or indeed even the image of themselves, as somehow libidinally interesting, as something that might be appealing or attractive? So Freud's idea that a new psychical action needs to be articulated is a challenge that Lacan takes up. And for him, he's going to say that the way that the infant moves from some autoerotic pleasures within their own body to being able to take on an image or the object of someone else as of libidinal interest requires that intermediary stage. And that intermediary stage is one of the mirror stage. It's one where they will take an image will be libidinally invested, an image will become important, and that is this first step to being able to take other images of other people as of sexual interest. So let's then go back. I've already noted that we have these challenges of prematuration. And I think it's useful just to pick out a few lines from Lacan's mirror stage essay. This is page 78 to the Bruce Fink translation of the full Icree. And I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit. Lacan is talking about, and here we go, the need to establish a relationship between an organism and its reality. This, you could say, is one of the challenges of prematuration, an imperative. It is, in a sense, a biological imperative, a life imperative. Lacan, of course, is not interested in accounts or explanations from the domain of biology alone, but he is certainly going to say that there is a need to establish a relationship between the organism and its reality. And I'm quoting, or as they say, between the Innenwelt and the Umwelt. Okay? There needs to be some kind of mediation between the inner world, the physiological experiential world of the newborn or young subject and their environment. He continues, in man, however, this relationship to nature is characterized by a primal discord. Things don't work so well. There's no automatic, there's no instinctual adjustment of the physiological experiences, the emerging elements of a self, of an ego within the human being that will naturally locate them within a natural domain. In my view, we find in man a veritable specific prematurity of birth. That's what I'm talking about in challenges of prematuration. Now let's see if we can make that a little bit more straightforward and give a couple of examples. Here's the first example, a little bit of a thought experiment. I want you to imagine this. There's a brand freshly born newborn. His name's Gerald, just for the sake of the example. Little Gerald is tiny. Little Gerald doesn't yet have a full sense of where his arms end, what his fingers are, where his feet are, how the whole thing fits together. He's been born. He is on his mother's chest. The breast is nearby. The mother's trying to get him to feed. And as all this is happening, a nurse walks past outside the door of this hospital room. The nurse drops a tray of glasses and plates. There's a huge noise. An airplane flies over above. Now, little Gerald's having like a whole lot of stimulus here. There's a noise from the outside, which is really loud. There's an airplane above. And for the sake of the argument, let's say little Gerald's got a little stomach pain as well. There's a pain in his stomach and his left leg is numb. How do you make sense of all of that array of stimuli? You could say that there's no clear, immediate reason why the noise, the disruption from outside is not understood by him as also somehow inside. What means that the noise is necessarily outside when it's impinging on his ears, on his hearing? And similarly, the pain in his belly, the pain in his gut, yeah, that I suppose is hurting him, but what's to make him so sure that's inside and not something that's pressing against another part of his body? Similarly, there's the mother's breast. The mother's trying to get him to feed. The breast is warm. He's battling a little bit, but his leg's numb. The breast is there. How do we know that the leg is or isn't his, whereas the breast is or isn't his? So a different way of describing this in terms of more psychological language. Lacan would presumably reject that language, but I think it does a useful job of trying to point to what we're focusing on here, is the notion of separation, individuation. How does little Gerald get a sense of where his body ends and the world begins? And how does little Gerald get a sense of what is in me as opposed to what's outside of me? So it's really important to grasp that particular challenge, which is both one of a bodily integrity, how you hold your whole body together, how your body comes together, its cohesion, its structure. And it's also one not simply of how my body all holds together, although that's an important challenge in and of itself. It's also the challenge of how I start to have a sense of an I. In other words, how I can pull together, integrate, make cohere all of these different experiences and sensations that are happening. How do I know that they are me, that this is who I am, that this is the zone of my ego subjectivity, whereas other things are not necessarily part of me? Now, for those of us who have gone beyond that level of development, You could say, well, it doesn't sound like much of a challenge. But it's very, very interesting here to bear in mind the challenges that some psychotic subjects face. In fact, we see some of exactly those issues of, you could say, failures of separation, individuation happening in psychosis. So in psychotic subjects, we often find this experience of, there's voices in my head. In other words, you could say that their thoughts, they're their own thoughts, but the thoughts are being experienced as if they come from the outside. In other words, the inside-outside differentiation is not working quite so well. We also have in psychosis this experience of, well, this is a foreign thing. This element of my body is not mine. It's somehow intrusive. It doesn't belong to me. So these basic challenges that I'm speaking about in terms of bodily integration, bodily wholeness, as well as subjective wholeness of separation, individuation, these are real challenges. And they are some challenges that some people have never fully surmounted. How does the body attain cohesion, integration? I suppose I've already mentioned this, but let's give another example. If I had no mirror, if I was not able to look at myself in a mirror, and a full-length mirror, how would I ever get an experience, an image of myself that integrates and unifies all the components? You could say, looking at myself here and now, I see a hand, another hand, an arm, my shoulders, the stomach, the trunk, my legs. I can see a whole bunch of different parts of myself. What I'm not quite able to see, though, is how my head is located on my body. For that, I need to look at a mirror. So what starts to become evident here is that one doesn't actually have a viable image, a viable map of how one's whole body fits together unless one has a minimal externalization of that body or an image, some kind of reflection. Now, of course, in different periods in human history, you could say that maybe mirrors of the sort that we are familiar with, or photographs or images of the sort that we are so familiar with, are not so commonplace. But of course, you could also argue, as in effect Lacan does, that in those points of history, we also use other human beings as our images. This will develop a little bit more as we continue. But the crucial point that I'm trying to get at here is that in order to get a sense of how your whole body fits together, you need to see it reflected. You can't get that simply by looking at your own body. A lovely example of this, I think, is dance studios. So if you're a dancer, as you know, and you're trying to improve your technique of a pirouette or whatever, in a dance studio, you've got mirrors all around the room, so you can see what your body is doing. And here we start to anticipate a theme that we'll move to, perhaps in the second lecture, and that is that for Lacan, the idea of the mirror stage implies a very specific type of temporality. It's a temporality of anticipation. That once one assumes an image, one is kind of moving towards what one might be able to do. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But here we go. The crucial point is simply to suggest that once I have an image, an externalization of my form, I can start to gain forms of physical coordination and motor coordination that I didn't have before. I need a map, as it were, of my body. I need for there to be something like a king of limbs. This is the name of a Radiohead album, just helps me remember it. The king of limbs here would be something akin to the ego, and the ego is made possible precisely by the taking in of an image. So, our last question, how is it that organism thinks of itself as an I? How is there a type of ego cohesion? So I already sort of mentioned this when I was saying it's not just about mapping the body and getting a sense of body coherence, body integration, arms, trunk, what I can do with the body, how the body fits together, how I can attain some kind of motor coordination. We also need to achieve the psychological function of thinking myriad experiences as mine, as I. Best example I can think of that is at a certain stage, it's the Rouge test. Many people have referred to this in the history of psychology, but in the Rouge test, you have a little infant, you put the infant in front of a mirror, and before you put the infant in front of a mirror, you put a little bit of rouge on their nose. So in the earlier stages of life, if you do that, the infant may not be particularly interested in the mirror, or they may kind of lose interest, or they may start to gain a little bit of interest. But at a latter stage, you can put the infant in front of the mirror, and they can immediately do that. In other words, they have already done that cognitive psychical operation of that is me. That's something that we need to figure out. How does that happen? Why does that process work whereby there's an almost instantaneous, that is me. That moment of jubilation is what the mirror stage will help us understand for Lacan. Okay, so we've got a sense of the challenges of prematuration. How is the infant to respond to these challenges pre-maturation? What's the magic bullet that enables them to survive, that enables them to have a rudimentary form of subjectivity and bodily integration? Well, you know where Lacan's going with this. The answer is an image of themselves, a mapping of the body, because once that happens, one has the basis of a viable ego. So just before concluding, let's make brief reference to a couple of examples from the animal kingdom, from ethology, the world of nature, zoology. It's very uncharacteristic, actually, in Lacan's later career that he would ever make mention of these type of examples, but, you know, in this early stage, in the mirror stage theorization, he does. And he gives us two examples, and I've added one. The first example is the female pigeon. He says, isn't this a weird thing? Zoology, ethology, still for me is like a realm of science fiction, but whatever. He says, and apparently this is true, that a female pigeon will not attain sexual reproductive maturity unless that pigeon sees another pigeon, or even simply a reflection of herself. In other words, an image is a crucial facet in the attaining of a degree of reproductive maturity. Lacan also talks about locusts. Let's see if I can find the actual quote. What does he say? In the case of the migratory locust, the shift within a family line from the solitary to the gregarious form can be sought about by exposing an individual at a certain stage of its development to the exclusively visual action of an image akin to its own. In other words, being able to make this shift within the world of a locust from being a simply solitary to a gregarious kind of insect requires the mediation of the image. So in both of those, we're getting a sense of why the mediation of the image is so crucial. In a way, you could say that although those are interesting, and although they point us in the right direction, the mediation of the image for the human subject is massively more important. These are kind of pointer ideas, but they become much, much more crucial when we think about human subjectivity and the development of the ego. The last example I have is not from any scientific basis, but simply from reading Far Side cartoons. I think many people know about Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz, he's an ethologist, he studies little ducklings, he studies a whole range of creatures. But the image many people have, kind of famous, humorous image, is that Konrad Lorenz has this experiment of sorts where he leaves a pair of boots next to some duckling eggs. And as the poor little ducklings hatch, they look and they have this so-called notion of imprinting. The first thing they see is the thing they're going to follow, because presumably that's usually the mother duck. And so we have the famous photographs of Konrad Lorenz going down to a lake and a whole stream of little ducklings following him because they've imprinted on his boots. What's the point of this? The point of this is not that human beings should be seen to have a similar type of functioning to animals. The point of these is to suggest that the mediation of the image plays a crucial role in many species. And Lacan's overarching argument is that the mediation of the image plays an even much more crucial organizing, restructuring role for human subjectivity. So let's end this, the first of 4 talks, with a homework exercise, which is kind of like a challenge. If this doesn't sound like a viable set of ideas, and if for you the idea that the image as a means of mediating experience in the world seems to be not something you're particularly convinced about, then this is your challenge. 3 days, no mirror activity whatsoever, please. No photographs, no looking in the mirror for the next 3 full days. And once you finish that challenge, come and watch the second of our lectures.